what I want to do in this talk is go over again how, like the subtitle says, how literalism and really sort of a real dependence on over literalism can really produce disastrous results, not only in Bible interpretation, but really in real life. And this, in my mind, is one of the best examples. Now, what I'm not saying is that it's never legitimate to interpret the Bible literally. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm not arguing that you should always interpret the Bible some other way. That's just absurd. Language is flexible. Texts are flexible. If you can figure out what literalism means, that helps. It's kind of an evasive target. When I say water, what do I mean? First thing you have to ask is it a noun or a verb? If it's a noun, do I mean H2O? Am I talking about a chemical formula? Am I talking about a pond, a lake, a drop, a stain? Am I talking abstractly? The waters of heaven. Okay. Literalism is a moving target. We just sort of think we know what it is, but it's not that easy. But I don't really care about that. That's not the point. What I'm saying here in this talk today at this point is if you can only think that way, sometimes historically it has really produced bad results. So here are the questions when it comes to race. This whole problem has a history. How did theories of race develop in Western Europe, Western culture? I don't know if you've ever asked yourself this question, but have you ever asked, where did this thinking come from? We've got different races, and some are superior and inferior. Because after all, the Bible, says every human being was created in God's image. How did we go from that, something that just seems really clear? And the Bible has dominated Western thinking, for millennia. How could people have missed that and come up with all these kind of strange ideas about race? How did that happen? On what basis did Christians, before, during, and after the Civil War, justify slavery using the Bible? Lots of them. You go back and you read the treatises of the day, the political debates. Mm-hmm. It can get unbelievably offensive, by our standards today. But people will quote Bible verses to justify just really offensive and strange ideas. Well, how did they think that worked? Why did they think that was a good strategy? And again, how did the whole imaging idea get sidestepped? Well, here's a short history of how we got into this problem. It begins really with the age of exploration, as far as, again, racism. I mean, obviously, before the 15th century, people could look at each other and see physical differences. Okay, everybody knew that. What I'm talking about is tying the physical differences of people to theology and being provoked into thinking, well, all these physical differences, some of them are better than others. How did that happen? So the late 15th century onward is really a mind shift in civilization. The old world, again, this is Europe, Africa, Middle East, and they're all connected. We have the Mediterranean sort of in the way there, but they're all connected. That's the old world. That's the world everybody knew prior to crossing the Atlantic, prior to exploring, way, way, way east, way, way, way south, way, way, way north, and having ships that could make these long voyages naturally resulted in people running into places that had people that had not been encountered before. So that was a significant shift. But if you're all on one side of the earth, if you're all like, hey, all this stuff joining, so you have migrations, we get it. That all changes when people cross the Atlantic. And they run into Indians. That's where they thought they were, the Indies. But they run into people, and after a while they figure out, well, this isn't the Indies. This is something else. Where did they come from? How in the world did they get here? Because this landmass really isn't connected to the other one in any way that we can conceive. How in the world do you get people over here? That was a huge blow. That was just really unexpected. So what do we do? Again, with these parts of the world where we're encountering people. So the New World was this real mind shift. Again, before the discovery of the New World, conceptions of what people would find was often influenced by mythology. And the mythology comes from greater antiquity. And it's just crazy stuff. For instance, did you know that in foreign lands there were monopods? C.S. Lewis has this kind of stuff in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, if you've ever read that. This is from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493. Well, we've heard that there are distant lands, or we imagine there to be distant lands, like, over the Atlantic. And you're going to run into people that look like this. Greek term is skiopods, shadow feet in Greek, because their feet were so big they could rest under the shade of them. It's just, again, it's cartoonish absurdity. But you'll find this, again, in Greek texts. Like Pliny the Elder in his Natural History. And guess what? Augustine in the City of God. Oh boy. Isn't that disturbing? Yeah. Because they're reading other sources. He has a whole chapter called Whether Certain Monstrous Races of Men Are Derived from the Stock of Adam or Noah's Sons. So he's already bought into the mythology that there are these freakish men somewhere out there in lands that we really haven't encountered. And if we happen to run into one, or if they're out there, and we presume they are, did they descend from Adam? See, that's going to be the question. When explorers in the 15th century start encountering humans where they don't expect to encounter them, and they're not freaks, this becomes the question. How'd they get there? Maybe they're not descended from Adam, like we are. That's where it's going to go. Another one, the Bleme, people without necks, Pliny, Natural History. You just didn't know. It's amazing, what people actually believe, but again, they don't know because they haven't been to those other places. So they make it up. That's what they do. 19th century, you get something else happen. So we've got the Age of Exploration kickstarts in the 15th century, and of course, it never stops. 19th century, you get the decipherment of ancient Near Eastern languages. This was another big deal. Because once Egyptian hieroglyphs were translated into English and other European languages, and Mesopotamian cuneiform, lo and behold, those cultures had long histories of humanity and long chronologies of kings and cities and other people that were not in the Bible. Some of them were, some of them weren't. So it's like, okay, who's right? What do we do with this information? Because up until this point, we didn't know it even existed. We only had the Bible. There were clear parallels, again, to stories of human origins, pre-flood civilizations. So there was some attachment to the Bible, but it was different. It had new information that, on the surface, it just didn't look like it could be put together. The chronologies and histories were a big deal because of Ussher. Now, Ussher lived in the 1600s. So he has this long chronology figured out based on biblical genealogies. But the problem with it, one of the problems, there's lots of problems with it, but one of the problems with it is Ussher's flood date calculated to 2348 BC, which is in the middle of the Pyramid Age, the Old Kingdom. But we didn't know that until we discovered and deciphered Egyptian. Oops. Well, how can you, because if we string those Egyptian chronologies together, and they're like normal lifespans and normal reign lengths, it's nothing bizarre like people are reigning 100,000 years, they're just normal. You string all those together, and you know what, there's a couple of them, like Shoshank. If that's the biblical Shishak, well, now we can sort of correlate a chronology here. And maybe Ramses or something like that, depending on when you date the Exodus. But if you work all that out, guess what? We have the Great Flood right in the middle of the Pyramid Age. That just doesn't work. Now, it works with a local flood, perhaps. But nobody at the time was thinking local flood. They were thinking global deluge. And so this freaked people out. What do we do with that? We got new people, we got new histories of civilization, we got new chronologies. What in the world should we do? And we won't go through the list. The Sumerian king list here is probably the most interesting because there are names in this list that correlate with Genesis 5. I think the chronologies, but anyway, subject for another time. 17th and 18th century, this is one that often isn't thought of, unless you've read Porton. The decipherment of Sanskrit in 17th, 18th century. Same thing. Now, this is from ancient India. So this is not a place that you'll find in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. This is a whole separate culture. And lo and behold, they've got a long, long, long history of human habitation with chronologies and empires and king lists and all this other stuff. How in the world do we reconcile this material with the Bible? We've got new people, new histories, new chronologies in places that aren't part of the biblical picture. This created a crisis. In 18th, 19th centuries, this was a huge deal to lots and lots of people. When Sanskrit was deciphered, here's another twist, it was found to be central to the field of comparative linguistics. Okay? The Sanskrit became sort of the premier language to study if you were going into linguistics at the time. Because Sanskrit, an ancient Indian language, turned out to be Indo-European. That's where we get the word Indo-European. Sanskrit, ancient language, had a relationship grammatically to languages like German, Greek, Latin, frankly. How in the world is that possible? It has the same language structure. It's not a Semitic language. And so again, they literally changed the term to Indo-European language because it's there. This also happened to be the era of higher criticism of the Bible and Darwinism. All of these forces are going to converge and create a huge crisis. So, let's just boil it down a little bit. Why are these other peoples not mentioned in the Bible? This is a logical question to ask. Can we consider the Bible an authority on human origins after all this stuff? Maybe the other civilizations had it right. In Europe, there was a subtext of this. How do we explain our racial heritage to all these other ones? Especially with that Indian thing going on here, with languages, the same family. What in the world is going on? There's no place you can turn to in the Bible, so it was thought, that you can explain this stuff. Indo-Europeans were not Semitic, therefore, and that's going to have disastrous consequences when people hop on that one. And you know what? Europeans, we inherited Christianity. Just think of the map of the Mediterranean. Who inherits Christianity? It's the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire covers the whole Mediterranean. What happens to the Roman Empire? It gets invaded by barbarian tribes in 476 AD, and the Western Empire collapses. The Eastern one survives a little bit for the days of Islam. But all those tribes eventually form the countries, the states of Europe. Britain, France, Germany. This is where they come from. But they're all evangelized because during the period of the Dark Ages, the books of the Bible and other classical texts, Greek and Roman texts, are hidden away in monasteries. That's what the Dark Ages is about. They hid the knowledge of the West. The church succeeds in winning the day and evangelizes all these places. The Vikings, if you watch that show, what network it's on or whatever. But this is how it was done. It was conflict. It was, again, who's going to win? The pagans, from the north, or is it going to be Christianity? Well, ultimately, we know Christianity won the day. Europe became a Christian landmass. And so Europeans rightly thought we're the descendants of all that biblical stuff. We inherited Christianity. They began to think of themselves, again, in linear terms. This whole history of the Bible, really leads to us because we're the inheritors of it. We are the church. We're the people of God. Because there are all these Christians here running around here. Well, you take that sort of situation and you discover that, our languages aren't related to the languages those Jews speak. And you know what? We really look like the people of God because we have Christianity. We won. Well, what about all these other peoples? What about the ones who aren't Christian? What about the ones who aren't us? What are they? Just a quote from an article here. At the beginning of the modern period, controversies having to do with the extent and the causes of human diversity were motivated by a genuine concern to make sense of the new ethnographic and physical anthropological information that was flooding into Europe as a consequence of the rapid rise of exploration, trade, and colonization. It just forced these questions to be asked. one of the most controversial interpretations of this new information, the theory of polygenesis, effectively deprived Christian scripture of its supposedly universal authority by decoupling the origins of pagan peoples from the account given in the book of Genesis of the origins of those humans whose generations extend back to Adam and Eve. It's from an article, The Pre-Adamite Controversy and the Problem of Racial Difference in the 17th Century. What all that means is this. Someone came up with the idea, you know what? I'll bet a good way to explain this from the Bible is to posit the idea that Adam and Eve were only the progenitors of one specific race, and the other races come from pre-Adamic humans or other humans who were alive around when Adam and Eve were around, co-Adamic. So you're either pre-Adamic or co-Adamic. But the important point is you're not Adamic. The Europeans are the Adamic race because we inherited the Judeo-Christian scriptures. This was the will of God. God's looking out for us. These other races were somehow originated in other ways. And you say, well, how in the world can you get that from the Bible? And here's where you get all these questions. No. See if I have it listed here. Wait till we get there. All these questions about where did Cain get his wife? How could Cain build a city after he got married by himself, just in his wife? There had to be other people around, right? Is it possible that Cain and Abel had different fathers? Because in Genesis 4:1, Eve says, I have gotten a man, and then there's a little particle, Hebrew particle, et, which can be translated with the Lord. So does that indicate that the Lord did something with Eve to produce Abel, but not Cain? This is where the idea of Cain being the seed of the serpent is born. Well, it's actually born in antiquity, but this is where it really sort of takes up steam, because it was a little opening in the text for people to posit another way to raise up a different racial line. What about the mark on Cain? Maybe that meant he was black. What about the curse on Ham? Maybe that was the color of his skin. People started using little snippets, little phrases, little things in the Bible as footholds to come up with biblical reasons, biblical explanations for how there could be other races of humans. Because they needed to, in their mind. They needed to answer these questions. Because they wanted to retain biblical authority. It's a natural impulse. If they care about the Bible, they've got to find this stuff in the Bible somewhere. They've got to use the Bible somehow to explain it. So their motivations might have been good, but they come up with really goofy stuff. And unfortunately, the law of unintended consequences, it leads to disastrous results, historically. Now, for unbelievers, this was a great time to be alive. Okay, because you could divorce the Bible from human origins. Darwinism and new science of geology and paleontology, dinosaur bones and all this stuff. That was awesome because the Bible couldn't accommodate that. Some of them, this was sort of the scientific-minded people. Now they found new reasons to just get rid of Scripture. Wonderful time to be alive. But there were others who decided, well, this sort of gives us the freedom to wonder about other texts, and let's approach them literally, like we did the Bible before, and see what comes out. So this is the era where you get alternative histories, things like the hollow earth, theosophy and Ariosophy. Again, myths about alternative races and Atlantis and all the subterranean, civilizations. This is the period where all of that begins. And they're free to use more than the Bible. Well, I'm going to take one sentence out of Plato that talks about Atlantis, and I'm going to write a book that has it as a full-blown civilization. And, down to the thing where I know how the city streets were laid out. I know what they ate for breakfast. Just this crazy stuff that you read in this period that is the direct result of over literalizing texts. It was just open season. Human origins, hey, let's come up with a new theory here because we can't rely on this one over here anymore. And you had an amazing output. This is why I don't know, again, for those of you who are familiar with me, I'm often on radio shows talking about like ancient alien stuff, debunking that. All that stuff comes from the 19th century. It's either this kind of literature or it's 19th century horror writers. They are literally making this stuff up. But now, we have people that take that and treat it like it's gospel truth. And they even marry it to the Bible. It's the same thing sort of all over again, but it has a long, long history. And if you're familiar with this literature, it's easy to watch the ancient aliens. I know where that comes from, I know where that comes from, I know where that comes from. But most people don't have that in their head. And so it's appealing for any number of reasons. Anti-Semitism gets a new rationale too. Isn't it great? Isn't it great that we're not Semitic? Sounds like a stupid song. Isn't it great to be not Semitic? Because we're Indo-European now, and now we have a little better clarification on how to divide the races. And there's no way that we can be related to them. And that's a good thing because they were Christ killers to begin with. Oh yeah. I wonder where they descend from. Because obviously they're not really the people of God, at least anymore. They're either divorced by God, or maybe that history in the Bible, maybe there's something fishy going on. Maybe the serpent seed is really the Semite and the seed of Adam. Because the good seed, evil, is us. Because after all, we won. We inherited the Bible. We have the church. We're in charge. Providence of God. Hey, again, these are simple thoughts, but you see how they can happen, how they can be put together, and ultimately where they go. Because we've lived through that part. Now, for people who cared about the Bible, again, their strategy was, we got to find some way to have the Bible say this stuff, or else we're in trouble. Okay, so that's what they did. It's an effort to retain the authority. So again, this is the era when you get the gap theory. Well, we'll posit a gap between Genesis 1 and 2. It's kind of a nice theory. This will be where we put all that dinosaur stuff and all the fossils. And we'll have the fall of Satan in there, and we'll have a pre-Adamic race in there, because if there's other races of humans before Genesis 1-2, then we know that the Adamic race that happens 24 verses later isn't this one. Woohoo! We win. Solution, problem solved. It's contrived. It has a history. Not only that, but you can't exegetically defend the gap theory either, because of the Hebrew syntax we talked about before. But, who cares? People just don't care. It still today is a theory that's popular because it answers certain questions. It has explanatory value. Okay? It had explanatory value when it was invented. It's not bad motivations. People are trying to cope with, these serious problems. And you have the pre-Adamism, co-Adamism, polygenism, more than one generation, of humankind. Again, you get all these things we've mentioned, non-Adamic races. Some of them will tie the Nephilim stuff in there, Cain and Ham and all that. But this is the era when all of this just sort of blows up and gains steam, because people want answers. Now, pre-Adamism, just a little bit of a history there. You'll actually find sort of the seedling ideas in Kabbalistic literature, which is medieval, a little bit, at least the suggestion in the Church Fathers. But most of it is really pushed by modernity. If you want to read a book on this, and this is a dense read. This is a Johns Hopkins University Press. It's an intellectual history, but it's awesome. Okay, it's a wonderful book. Adam's Ancestors: Race, Religion, and Politics of Human Origins. It goes through all of this in sometimes excruciating detail. Isaac de la Pereire was the first person to really try to articulate this. He was a Calvinist, Portuguese Jewish origins from Bordeaux. Here's the title of his book. I love these old books that have these long titles. Men Before Adam, or a discourse upon the 12th, 13th, and 14th verses of the 5th chapter of the Epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Romans, by which are proved that men were created before Adam. Wonderful title. 1656. This was a widely read and hotly debated book, as you can imagine. Here was his idea, here was his position. He focused on explaining Paul's words that, quote, until the law, sin was in the world, but sin was not imputed when the law was not. He didn't believe this was a reference to the Mosaic law, this law. That was his launching point. So that's not the Mosaic law. That was a law given to Adam. The implication is there must have been humans before Adam, because there was a time that was before the law, pre-law, and people were sinning. So there must have been people around. That was his thesis. That's how he argued for pre-Adamic origins. He also liked the local flood, which didn't make him any friends either. Now, it's important to point out he was not a racist. He did not believe that not descending from Adam, missed the word there, didn't mean that Negroes, for example, were animals. You will see this kind of rhetoric in 18th, 19th century literature. That Negroes were they were outside of the Adamic race, but that also sort of made them kind of an animal as well. He was motivated by the questioning and to take all this non-biblical stuff like the chronologies of history, take that seriously. So he wasn't doing racial stuff. He wasn't concerned about establishing the inequality of races. People who followed him were. Pre-Adamism was considered heretical when it came forth, but once you get theories like the gap theory, it became a little more palatable because it was viewed as helping to solve the problem. Another quote, written and American practitioners of science were generally drawn from the ranks of the religious and social establishment. Okay, this is going to be, I think this is from Livingstone. Since students of nature and human nature thus continued to ground their scientific endeavors in natural theology, frequently in a biblicist moral, basically lots of scientists in Britain and America were still Christians, is what this is saying. Because of that, it was necessary to find some means of integrating the findings of the new sciences, ethnology, archaeology, geography, anthropology, with theological principles. In other words, scientists who were still Christians, really, they wanted to have the Bible fit this too. And so what happens is, in this context, pre-Adamism therefore provided a convenient, although frequently contested, vehicle by which science and theology could be brought together. So some of your most articulate pre-Adamic and co-Adamic defenders are actually Christians who happen to be famous scientists, in the era, because they had a vested interest in trying to figure this out. So it comes from an article by Livingstone, author of the same book. It was presumed that because it was the man of the Bible who was created in the image of God, if people on the other side of the world had a separate creation, then they could not be seen as unequal in terms of relative likeness to God to those in the Christian world. By the 19th century, though, many found it a welcome idea to divorce the Negro and the Native American from whites when it came to having common ancestors from the Garden of Eden. What is it? You realize what that means. People found it offensive to think that Negro, that Native American, that they come from the same stock as once inhabited the Garden of Eden like we did. People just didn't want to hear that. There were a lot of people that just did not want to hear that because they viewed the other races as inherently inferior. So to suggest that we all come from Eden, no, we don't. No, we don't. They just didn't want to buy it. So one origin, one Adamic race, there are no other races, requires you to admit that. So polygenism was, now we have a way to divorce ourselves from the Negro, from the Native American, from the Indian. In some contexts, missionary work suffered. The philosophy was, let them alone. They aren't descended from Adam and Eve. They aren't like us. Let them alone. Others, though, soon shifted to, they're not like us, so let's dominate them. Let's enslave them. If they didn't descend from Adam and Eve, they weren't created in God's image. Therefore, they can't really be like fully human, which means they're sort of like subhuman. And once you go to the subhuman, you're thinking in animalistic terms. And that's where this rhetoric comes from. So this sort of racist thinking is driven, probably a strong word, for some it was driven. Let's just say this sort of racist thinking was an unintended consequence of the need to account for other races in the world that were discovered and maintain biblical authority. We have to find this stuff in the Bible somewhere. We have to come up with an explanation that jives with the Bible somehow. And the easy path, as bizarre as it sounds to us, was to have separate creations of humans, pre-Adamism and co-Adamism. And the Europeans, the ones who are doing the thinking here, the ones who are driving the bus, they get to be descended from Adam. They're the ones who come from Eden. They're the ones who are in the image of God. They're the race, catch this, who are the most like God. The other ones are not. And it works out historically into slavery, justification of slavery, and all sorts of really horrible stuff. And this is why the Christian community, many in the Christian community, especially those who depended on the slave trade, like in the American South, this is why they thought what they were doing was a biblical position. Because they're not humans like us. Now, eventually, people in Europe and people in America are going to resist this a lot. You're going to have the abolitionists movement come out. You're going to have clearer thinking win the day. But this is why you can have Christians on both sides of this issue. Again, feeling forced in the name of defending biblical authority or biblical literalism or something. We've got to come up with an explanation. And this is where they went. You had racists, Caldwell, Wharton, Joseph, Josiah. Now, if you ever read anything about the history of race, the racial stuff in America, these are familiar names. Again, they compared blacks to the pre-Adamite beasts who restored the ark with the other animals. And they could use that rhetoric because, again, they didn't think of them as human in the truly Adamic terms. They thought of them as something else. They're a different category. Carroll denied blacks had souls, since pre-Adamites wouldn't have had any before God invented them for the white Adam and his kin. See, it was Adam, remember in Eden, that God breathed into him, and man became a living soul. It didn't happen to the other. And you see the thinking. Again, just this whole inferiority rhetoric, even the evolutionary thinking. Only God could have directed evolution to produce the white race. Even they get on the bandwagon here. So again, eventually in Europe, polygenism is going to fuel the Aryan invasion theory. That's, we're going to get around to ancient India. How did the ancient Indian language, how did Sanskrit have Indo-European origins? It's easy. People who lived in Europe migrated down there in ancient times and civilized the savages, and then eventually at some point moved back to Europe. Aryan means high-born, okay, superior race, master race. And there's a master race in India because we put them there through our migrations. It's all about us, the Europeans. Now, eventually, the Germans are going to take this one step further and say, you know what? We kind of like that master race idea, but you know what? It's not really all of Europe because the Germans are even better because we have this ancestry from the north. There was this whole, again, logic chain about Nordic origins that made the Germans the masters of the master race, the ultimate master race. This is where you get Aryan racial mythology, which the Nazis loved and used, for their own propaganda. It has its roots in this problem, this discussion, because people just ran with it and just did crazy stuff with it to legitimize what they wanted to do politically, what they wanted to do economically, what they wanted to do really religiously. They just took it and ran with the wind. And we're still living with the results. We're still in this boat. So anyway, that's the end of it. We can take Q&A, we can break for a little while. But I think the lesson here again is, look, it's reflexively, it's an understandable thing when science comes along with a finding that appears to contradict or do damage to the Bible. to think a thought like, we kind of find that in the Bible somewhere. It's in a Bible code, or like it's in the shape of the letters of Hebrew. All these things, by the way, are still current. Bible codes and letter shapes, encoding encrypted mathematical information about the quantum world. It's just bizarre stuff. But it comes, with this impulse of protecting Scripture, which is a good impulse. But sometimes these impulses have serious, unintended consequences. Because you don't know what the next guy down the road is going to do with your idea. Or the next generation. Your idea becomes popular. You don't get to control that. You don't get to decide how that's applied. It's unintended consequences. That really you don't even have to create that theory. In my view, is if you're thinking better about Scripture. Now we're back to the Genesis talk. Just let the Bible be what it is. The Bible doesn't discuss these other races for a simple reason. Nobody knew about them. Nobody knew about these places. The biblical writers tell you what the nations were that they knew about. They list them in Genesis 10. There's 70 of them. The Bible is an ancient, pre-scientific, Mediterranean-centered document. This is where God chose to speak, and when God chose to speak, and how God decided he would speak. These are God's decisions, not mine. No one else's. So God deemed people back then fully capable of writing out their own history, and he's going to act in their history, and he wants them to write that down so there's no mistake that I am active in human history, I'm interested in human history, I have a plan for humanity. All this stuff that we read in Scripture, this is what God wanted communicated. He's not articulating racial theory. He's not articulating the answer to Darwinism. Darwinism is not even in the picture. He's articulating things that theologically are just crucial to believe, to hold, that can be tested for coherence among their competing theological ideas. And that's what philosophers do, that's what theologians do, that's what biblical scholars do, it's what we're supposed to do. But instead we find ourselves at times fighting these debates where we cede ground to the other side. We let them frame the discussion. And all I'm saying is don't let them frame the discussion. You frame it. Because otherwise you're playing on their own terms. And you're going to have to retreat, like back in this day. We got to come up with something here, that'll satisfy our community. Even if the scientists hate it, we'll be okay. So let's do that polygenism thing. That works. Oh yeah, it worked. Worked a little too well, actually. I think we need a bit of a mental shift. The idea is simple. Let the Bible be what it is. Honor God's decisions. God decided when to get written, who wrote it, and what they knew. And God was fine with it. It's okay. God knew what he was doing. He knew what he was getting. Just let it go. Let it go. And take the theological propositions that are there, no matter when they're written. They're going to be clear. And let those be the item of debate. Let those be tested for coherence. Because you can win that battle. And for millennia, Christians have been winning that battle. It's just now we're distracted. Okay, any question? Thanks for coming.
So I have a question. My first question is going to be about the history of Arianism. As you were getting through that last talk, you really summarized that. Is there anything else to that? And then that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, I guess. I'll wait and ask that after you.
I mean, it really depends on how much detail you want, because if you have the handbook to the portent, the best history of the Aryan mythology is Polyakov's book.
Yeah.
It's very detailed, but I think still readable for the most part. And you also get a lot of the history of the whole Indo-Aryan debate, because the Aryan invasion theory, again, that Europeans invaded and civilized the savage and all that stuff, that is hotly debated, even today. That by no means is something you could look at and say is today the sort of the dominant paradigm. That's not the way it's perceived anymore, but it still has adherents and components. And now you get into different migration models because of genetics and things like that. Science is a little better on it. But if you want really, again, a solid scholarly discussion of all aspects of the Indo-Aryan debate, Polyakov will give you the theory, the view from Western Europe, but I'm trying to remember what the author's name is. It's in the bibliography. It's the one on Vedic origins. There's a debate. It's an Oxford title, Vedic origins, which is really, really dense. But it's really quite good. It takes you through in considerable detail the whole upheaval that the discovery and the decipherment of Sanskrit caused in Europe, and what the reactions were to it. And it gets into how that was used by ultimately racial theorists to diss the Hebrew origin stories. Again, they began adopting the Sanskrit version of these things specifically to sort of drive the nail in the coffin of biblical origins. So some of them thought it was just wonderful fodder for doing that, along with Darwinism and other things like that. So those two books, again, they're dense reads, they're academic works, but they're really quite good. Now, if you're asking about Aryan racial mythology in relation to occult thought, there's, again, a very expansive literature on that. Some of those books will be in that bibliography. I have a pretty decent library on Nazi occult mythology, and there's a lot of, I won't say a lot, there are 10, 15 really good journal articles on Aryan occult mythology. I think the best book, I wish I had internet access and showed it to you, but I think the book to read to understand what the Nazi ideology was, what drove the SS, okay, and then how it filtered down to the masses, is it's by a guy named Riedels, Redles. I'm trying to remember the exact title here. It's not Aryan Reich, maybe it's the Nazi Reich. It's Hitler's Millennial Reich. And it really goes into, it's a theological treatment of how not only Hitler, but how certain aspects of Nazi racial theory and occult racial theory created and both created and fed into and justified Hitler's messianic complex. How he viewed himself as a messianic figure, and that his battle with the Jew, with the Bolsheviks, was cast in apocalyptic terms, and that he really thought he was doing the work of God, the work of his gods anyway. It's really fascinating, and he's a historian, it's an academic book, but it is the thing that I've never read anything that makes more sense out of Nazi ideology and motivation. Again, I'm talking about the SS now, the occult theorists, the people who drove the bus, than that book. It's great. So I'd recommend that one for that sort of thing. But if you want something specific, Nazi occultism, there are half a dozen good scholarly books on that. I can send you the titles, but most of them are probably going to be listed in the bibliography for the handbook.
Well, the next question I had was, there seems to be a traceability or a trend with the way we really, I guess I would say, the way we really just mess things up, specifically.
They're humans, it's what we do.
Well, yeah. I really like how in the unseen realm you describe that, how God, gives us this opportunity and paves the way for us to fix how we mess up His plan, vision, and we continually just mess things up. But in this case, I see a connection today through what we discussed with different faith-based systems, mythologies, and I can see where these trajectories go, and with Gnosticism especially. But I wanted to know about, are there books or resources with regard to Islamic trajectories and the Ishmael situation. Is there anything to that? And then also when you have other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism and stuff, where do those things play?
Play into what?
I guess the supernatural worldview, the biblical worldview, and are there connections?
Well,
They just don't exist.
I mean, there's any number of introductions to world religions that you can get. You know, the Ishmael thing. It really depends because it's hard to say because a lot of what goes on in the name of Islam today it's really not theological. I mean, you could look at it and know that there are theological roots there. But that's different than saying the guy holding the gun is thinking theology. Most of the people holding the guns are not thinking theology. They're thinking lots of other things. Again, but we can look at it, and scholars of Islam can look at it and really do a good job explaining why what they're doing or how what they're doing fits into elements of the Quran or the Hadith. And that's not difficult to do. But is the average foot soldier thinking anything like that? That's the difficulty, because many of them are not. It's purely political. It's driven by negatively hatred for somebody else, or positively the caliphate. And they're not thinking of even the caliphate in theological terms. They're thinking of it in control terms, submission terms, subjugate their enemies, show that their own superiority, the superiority of their religion, or Muhammad, or whatever it is. Again, these radical Islamic terrorists are not theologians. They're killers. They're not theologians. So it really depends on how you're thinking about why they're doing what they're doing. And again, it's really easy for us to sit back and analyze it and do it correctly. Well, they're doing that because this is what it says in the Quran, this is what it says in the Hadith. Well, okay, you get a gold star for the day, but what you just said, the guy holding the gun may have never even thought, or doesn't care. Who knows what's driving the individual, unit, whatever you want to call them, gang, thugs, whatever. So it's really not that neat of a question. It's not that easy of a question. In terms of of Islam itself, I think again, historians of Islam will tell you that Allah. It's the only word in Arabic that they could use for God. That doesn't mean it's the God of the Bible or the God of anything else. It's a Semitic word. It's what it is. They don't have another one that's adequate. So, specifically with Islam, Allah, is going to be the God. So it's a statement. It's a monotheistic statement about that particular deity. But historians are going to look at that and say, what would become the focus of Muhammad's religion. Back in pre-Islamic times, this region, worshipped a different god, the moon god, Sin, or something like that. And all that's true too. So you could look at that and say, and I do think, thoughts like this, that a lot of what goes on in Islam Islam, just on a purely theological level, is really a twisted imitation of certain points of biblical theology. And if you read the Quran, I don't know if you've ever read it, but a lot of it is really taken from the Old and the New Testament, both. I mean, it's hard not to call it plagiarism. But, with certain key things, certain names switched and that sort of thing. Because what it is, it's an alternative history of, the line of Abraham and through Ishmael. But the Quran on another page say things like Isaac's birth was supernatural. It will say that very transparently. It doesn't deny that at all. It doesn't deny that Jesus' birth was supernatural. So it's just not a neat picture. It's hard to say, well, they're doing this because of this verse over here. Who knows? Who knows what they're doing? But I do think there's this counterfeit element to it. I think it's a very enslaving system. Just because of the demands it puts on people, very works-oriented. So in that sense, I think it's just it's a misdirection. At best, it's a misdirection and a counterfeit to the gospel, to the biblical story, biblical salvation history. But beyond that, again, it's difficult to know what anybody's thinking. And yeah, the Quran does legitimize violence at certain points and against the non-believer and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, I had Muslim friends in Madison that would look at what's going on and just be appalled because it's fair to say because they're westernized, but they do want to practice their faith in a Western context, and that's what they were doing. It never occurred to them. I mean, we had one guy. I worked as a security guard in grad school, and the guy I replaced the shift with was a Muslim. So I'd go in, and he, sometimes I'd show up early, or he'd get there, at different times. We would replace each other, and he'd say, can you give me 10 minutes to do my prayer? And then my shift would be over. Fine, whatever. I mean, you could be nice to him, you could witness to him, tell him I'm a Christian, and that sort of thing. There was never any recoiling in horror, treating me bad. There was nothing like that. He just wanted to be left alone. So I don't know where anybody really lands. What offends me today is the resistance to this stupid, politically correct notion that there is no such thing as Islamic radical terrorism. That's just absurd. I mean, what world are you living on? Go to the Sudan and spill that garbage. It's just ridiculous. So it's hard, for Americans not to take, again, something as naive and self-serving politically as statements like that, and then, get questions about Islam and prophecy and all this stuff. It's hard not to think about it in terms of the thing that you really dislike or hate or object to or wish wasn't real, wish to be eliminated. But it's not that neat. So, if you're going to take biblical prophecy at face value, if you're going to orient certain things to their original context, then you are dealing with nations that today are under Islamic control. Persia, Babylon, Iraq. I mean, it's just geography. That's what it is. So if you want to try to orient, again, some eschatological thinking in that way, well, then the natural candidate to think about is Islam. But the question remains, well, is that what they were thinking in the first century when they wrote the book of Revelation? That time where Islam didn't exist? Okay, is that really what they're thinking? I don't know how you'd say that, but if you're looking at things today, trying to, again, do eschatology, whatever that means, then you are dealing with countries that right now are under Muslim control. It's just the way it is, just geography. That was kind of random. I don't know if that hit anything you care about.
Well,
Yes, sir.
maybe not a question, maybe it'll spark a question, but I was over in Israel and Palestine and Syria here a couple of years ago. Well, I wasn't inside the Syrian country. I was looking over the fence looking into Damascus because they wouldn't let us go into.
No, I know right where you mean. Yeah.
And the Golan Heights there.
Yep.
And we part of it was a social justice group I was with. It was with Catholic Charities, and we talked to some Syrian refugees. We also got to talk to some of the Palestinian PLO local leaders there. We also got to talk to some of the Knesset leaders, and boy, what an eye opener that is. Once you talk to the Jewish people, and Yahweh gave them that land, they want Palestinians gone. I mean, they were all the non-Jews out of the country. That's their land. And then you talk to the Palestinians. Well, Allah gave them that land. They want the Jews gone.
Sure.
And that's going to be quite an issue to try to resolve over there. I mean,
I think some of the things. I have to be careful what I say here. I don't know enough about the Quran to know if there's a counterpart to this, but in the Hebrew Bible, there are laws permitting the foreigner to live in the land. In other words, the only mandatory expulsion were the original Canaanites and different people groups, especially giant clans, had to be eliminated. But even in the context of a post-conquest situation, the presence of the foreigner is built into the Mosaic law. So I say that to say this, in terms of if you had Israelis who were serious about their own Hebrew Bible, in other words, if the issue was theological,
Yeah.
there's certainly a lot in the Hebrew Bible that they could use to coexist. But a lot of this is not theological.
That's right.
It's dealing with political events of the past and abuses of the past and broken promises of the past, invasions and all sorts of stuff. So
the land use issue.
Right. They're very simple issues like that. I mean, there's so many issues. And so until you get a people, even if you had the prime minister, even if you wanted to do this theologically, you want to go back to do it the way the Torah says and everything coexist, you still have to have the mass of people think the same way because it's a democracy. I don't see a real, again, clear theological solution to that. Of course, some of the Jews are looking for the Messiah to come back and settle that issue and all that. But a lot of the Jews, I remember when I was over there in the late 1980s, our guide, not in an offensive way, but our guide made it pretty clear to us that the God for most Jews was their Uzi or their M16.
Yeah.
Because they were constantly in defensive posture, and that's just the way they thought about themselves and why they existed. And that's, again, theologically offensive to a conservative Jew, Hasid, but that's where a lot of Israelis are at. You could see how they could get there, but it's just, I'm not excusing a lack of faith or bad theology, but that's where they're at.
Well, they talked about Uzis and all that there. I know every street corner, every building of any importance, you had maybe several, and most of them were younger people, 18, because in Israel, all people,
it's
mandatory.
Yeah.
So they were standing around and with their Uzis and all that there, and
it's such a different climate than it was in the late 80s, because the only time we ever saw a guard was when we went to the Golan, and then they wanted their pictures taken with us, or when we went to the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
A guy had to check his weapon, and we didn't even know he was armed, and he didn't have to be. He just felt better being armed, and he told us. But I didn't see a soldier the whole time. But now,
they're all over the place.
Yeah, I don't have any doubt of that.
And we were told, don't you dare go up and talk about, hey, it's a nice day, isn't it? If you don't have anything to do with them, and if they ask you for your passport or something, you hand it to them.
Yeah.
And then when they hand it back, say thank you and go on. They said if you try to get friendly with them or something like that, you could be in trouble.
Well, we had a guy in our group that tried to flirt with one of the Israeli guards. She was a good-looking girl, and she was having none of it.
Yeah.
He went nowhere.
But the other thing that struck me as kind of interesting is, you hit upon it, the Israelis, the Jewish and the Islamic people, all claim lineage to Abraham. Abraham's father. And you're right about Isaac and Jacob, because we got into some discussions.
There are hints in the Quran. Again, the Quran doesn't deny the supernatural birth of Isaac or even Jesus. And there are Islamic commentators, again, that seize upon that and the whole land story. Because if you're gonna accept that about Isaac, you have to accept his primacy in some way. So I've actually read Muslim commentators that say that the Quran and the Hadith would justify coexistence, again, in the land, allowing the Israelis to have the claim, but then reaching some agreement of mutual coexistence. But again, you're not going to hear that rhetoric either from the Muslim world, because they're not doing their own theology in that sense either. They're focused on, again, removal, getting rid of the Jews and all this kind of stuff. So we could sit here as intellectuals and look at the Quran and say, hey, there's this verse over here that lets you live together in the land. But nobody's going to care. They don't even want to hear that because of all this again, prior history that's led up to where we're at today. It's not going to dent. It's not going to phase them at all. Go ahead.
There's this thing in Christian Middle Earth that I ran into where it's like, I think it's for the scope of what we're talking about here with regard to grammar and stuff with creation, this Lilith thing, and he created the male and female, and then later it's talking about how from Adam he created Eve with the rib. And so there's this, I think, point that people will see where they can insert this Lilith thing. So I just wanted to know, is there anything to that?
There's no exegetical defense of Lilith being another mate for Adam. It's primarily a medieval idea. Kabbalistic literature does a lot with that idea. Lilith in antiquity, in the biblical world, was a female demon. So it's also the word for owl, by the way. But so you'll get references to it in the Hebrew Bible. Just kind of on one hand. There's nothing exegetical that's going to produce what the Kabbalah is doing, with Adam and Eve.
I wonder how much of the dictionary of demons and deities.
It has an entry on Lilith. Yeah.
Because when you look at even in the Gnostic presentation, there were genders in some of these beings, supernatural beings.
It's a very normal idea. In polytheistic systems as well. How do we get other gods? Well, they just supposed to have babies. It's the language of experience, of human experience, applied to the supernatural world. So if this is what you're doing, you can't invent the language of non-human experience because you don't know what that is, because you're human. So a lot of these things, again, tend to get cast in these very understandable, normative human terms. Because like Mesopotamians even had gods before the gods. The ultimate gods were like elements of reality, earth, wind, fire, clay, dirt, all that kind of. But again, just look at what you're dealing with. These are things that humans experience. And, hey, this is what the ground's made of. And they've got water over here. And these are things they experience through the human senses, and they know they didn't put it here. So what is it? And they could tell that, hey, there's lots of this stuff, and the whole earth as we know it is probably made of like 3 or 4 of these kinds of things because we keep running into it everywhere. And then there's fire. That might be another one because we don't really know where that came from because we're not chemists. Okay, so that's where these primary building blocks of life idea comes from. It's the language of human experience, relating to the natural world and trying to sort of do something abstract with that. When it comes to biblical theology, God is described in feminine terms in certain places. In other words, feminine activities. Like the hen gathers her children, so God gathers the children of Israel, or something like that. So there will be sort of culturally feminine metaphors that are used of God's activity and behavior on occasion. But God has no body. He doesn't have biological gender. But yet he created biological gender, and that's the way life in the embodied world works. You have to have it because, again, they don't know about genetics. They don't know about viruses. They don't need population. They don't know any of this stuff. So this is how they're going to frame the world they know, and this is how they're going to talk about the world they experience. But yet they're very careful, again, biblical theology, to attribute what is here, not to themselves or not to some spontaneous thing or not to some other God. They're always very careful to do that.
Do you expect heaven? Do we know?
I think heaven is the global Eden.
So perhaps gender roles.
If we have the Edenic situation repeated again, and plus the whole idea of being able to recognize each other and all that. Again, these are biblical theological strands that go into this. We don't need to reproduce. We don't need to sustain our population anymore. We don't need to be fruitful and multiply to make the earth like Eden because it is like Eden. Okay? We don't need to do that anymore. So hence you get Jesus talk about meeting, marrying, or giving marriage in heaven. Again, this ultimate afterlife place. So again, these little scattered comments you get in the Bible about the afterlife make sense on that level. We're not told a great deal about it, but ultimately that's the goal. The restoration of Eden on a global scale is the ultimate afterlife. That is the goal. God, heaven returned back to earth. We don't need a separate place called heaven because it's here. It's this, like it was originally intended to be. It's come full circle. So I don't distinguish, heaven from the global Eden in that sense. Obviously, you have afterlife language and descriptions Well, what happens before that? When people die, to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord. Well, I get all that. But, the question is directed at, when I hear a question about heaven, I hear final destination, final eschatological culmination of all this stuff. What the intermediate state is or is like, we're told very little about that. What's it like to be with the Lord, in the presence of the Lord? Sure, it's good, but I don't know what it's like. The only time you actually get a description is, again, at the final eschaton, where the earth is remade. You get the global lead. So, and again, why would that be? Because that's what we can understand, at least a little bit. Because it's using embodiment language of a place. We can sort of process that a little bit. Whereas if we go off into la la land, and, God seizes the arm of the human writer, and I'm going to take over here. And it's a bunch of stuff that we can't even process, or that the writer has no idea what he just wrote. God could say, well, that's what the afterlife's right there. Read it. Well, we're not going to get it. It's so utterly foreign to us. So we don't get information that we can't really process. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. The Bible uses the terminology of latitude and longitude for heaven and hell, like they're places you can travel to. There's a prescribed distance. Biblical writers have to use that language because guess what? They're embodied. They only know this world of space and time. They have to use geographical language for the afterlife. They have to talk about it like it's a place that has latitude and longitude. They can't do anything else. What would you expect them to do?
One question I had from last night was, so we talked about God anthropomorphically in Jesus. So in the angel Yahweh, this one like the Son of Man, look human.
That's what it means, human one.
Human. And we also see imagery in, for example, like cherubs and seraphs, and Ezekiel's vision where we have these angelic beings with this description of these things eyes. I guess specific to the divine council, are we given just visual descriptions of how they looked separate to?
Yeah, I mean the descriptions you get, again, these are heavenly throne room visions. So they are glimpses of other realities, in the spirit world, whatever. I think the language that's used to describe certain beings is given or is used to make the function or class, if you will, of a divine being clear. In other words, it's not necessarily what they actually look like in real space and time, like if one visited, because frankly, when divine beings show up here, the required form of dress is usually flesh, human flesh. They look like people. But when you're describing, again, the throne room of God, and you're using terms like cherubim and seraphim, these are both terms, again, I talked about it last night, one is Akkadian, the other one's Egyptian. They're both throne guardians, which would make sense because the scene's in the throne room of God. It makes sense that cherubim in Eden, because, hey, that's where God lives. It's his house. They're guarding the way. This is what they do functionally. This divine being has a function to guard the throne of Yahweh or whatever. And I think the reason for the difference in the description really depends on context. For instance, if you're talking about Genesis 1 to 11, there are lots of things in Genesis 1 to 11 that have a distinctive Mesopotamian context. All the way from the first three verses, I didn't mention, but the syntax mimics the Enuma Elish epic in Akkadian, has the same syntactical structure as Genesis 1, 1 through 3. Again, I don't think that's an accident. You get the Sumerian king list. Guess what? It's Sumerian. It's Mesopotamian. Tower of Babel. Guess what? It's in Babylon. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The Apkallah. You get all these things in these 11 chapters. So, yeah, I would expect when you're talking about a throne guardian there, you're going to use an Akkadian term. In Isaiah 6, we get this Egyptian terminology. Archaeologically, and both in terms of historical chronology, what's going on in Judah, and Judah's relationship to the powers around her, both in the Bible and outside the Bible. Egypt is the big deal because they're basically the only thing standing between Babylon and Judah is Egypt. That's who Nebuchadnezzar has to defeat before he can go into Jerusalem and destroy it. So Egypt, in many ways, because of political alliance, is viewed as a good guy. Because They're the reason we're still here, ostensibly. And the only thing keeping Nebuchadnezzar from the game is their interest in this part of the country. But it's well known archaeologically that Hezekiah used Egyptian iconography in his royal seal. And I'm wondering if I have a picture of this. Yeah, I do. Let me just find it. I'll show it to you. And Hezekiah, again, the son of Ahaz, and there you have Isaiah 6. It's the same era. I can type straight here. Let me just find this. Oh, a good memory here. Where would I have this? I think I have this. Let's see here. Let's try this. Oh boy, let's try that. I'll tell you here real quickly if I have it. That's not the one. Hold on. Boy, if I had internet access, I'd already have this. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm probably not going to find it there. Yeah, I don't know. I know I've got it here. Just give me one more shot. Because it's kind of a neat picture. Oh, there we go. That's Hezekiah's seal.
Really?
Yeah. It's Lamed is L. That's the possessive preposition. So it's belonging to. And then we've got Hizkiyahu. And then we've got Hezekiah of Ahaz Melech, which is King Ahaz. Hezekiah of King Ahaz. In other words, it's his son. Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz. This is his seal. And it's a very obvious Egyptian theme. So there are things associated with Hezekiah's reign that take advantage of Egyptian royal iconography. And what's the answer to that? Maybe he just liked it. Maybe it's kind of cool. I like the design. Let's do that. Let's use that. Maybe he wanted to associate himself with the power of Pharaoh. Maybe it denotes that, hey, Pharaoh and I are buddies. Don't forget it. That just, who knows why they're doing this. But there's an Egyptian flavoring to the Judahite kings in Isaiah's era. So when Isaiah has this vision in chapter 6, he uses seraph, which are throne guardians. So he uses a language familiar to the people that they would have picked up on. Okay, seraph, seraphim, they're throne guardians, that kind of thing. But it's the same function as a cherub. It's just a different word in a different context. Yeah, I can't really remember that. Yeah.
So in your presentation, you were talking about just like the scientific knowledge of people in biblical times, just like the length of the hair for the women, for instance, like that's just ridiculous.
It is. See, now you're tempting me to get into that.
No.
You would not believe.
Basically, what I was curious about is Jesus in the Gospels dealt a lot with the supernatural realm head on, just like casting out demons and all. Like, there's a lot of things that are kind of similar between when you heal people and when you casted out demons.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's possible that he was always healing somebody, but like they thought a lot of it was him just casting out demons?
I don't think you can make. Yeah, I don't think you can make that whole cloth substitution.
Mm-hmm.
And there are passages that link the demonic possession language with sort of an illness, and then when they recover, when the demon's driven out, the language of sort of a healing or recovery is used, like you're saying. But you don't always find that. I mean, and even outside the New Testament, when Paul, not Paul, but when the people who aren't Paul are trying to, Jews trying to drive out demons, and the demon possessed man, the demon says to him, well, Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but who are you guys? he basically kicks their butt. You don't get the language of infirmity or mental illness or something like that, because that's usually where people want to go. Take all the demonic language and assign it to some sort of psychological or mental condition or something like that. I think there are some places you could argue for an association, but the language of the New Testament doesn't allow you to throw out the one side of the analogy in favor of the other. It still has the demonic language in it. Okay, and then there are other passages where you don't have that sort of healing illness kind of element in the passage. So I don't think you can just sort of sweep one direction or the other.
Why aren't we dealing with stuff like that? Kind of where we're at here in America today.
Well, there are some people who are.
Yeah.
But as far as a large scale, well, there could be any number of reasons for that. I personally, this is just my personal opinion. I don't have a verse for this or anything like that. But I tend to think that spiritual powers are most pronounced and most present and transparent when two conditions prevail. When people openly acknowledge, and it frames their worldview that they are there, and when the church is not hopelessly worldly. I think, again, those conditions where the church is being really serious, they're being serious about the spiritual world, and they are predisposed to anticipate engagement with it, and they're actually doing the job. Because that is something that needs to be dealt with on the other side. I don't look at least the Western church as being terribly. I don't look at the Western church and think of the book of Acts in either of those ways. I look at the church in other parts of the world, and I do think of the book of Acts in both regards. I think we're far too enlightened, quote unquote, and settled and comfortable and willing to. We don't really think seriously that this world is not our home. We're just not engaged like that. Where in other places of the world, that is a life and death question. That is what you wake up thinking every day, because that's what's going to get you through the day. This world really isn't my home. While I'm here, I have a job to do. For the Lord, I'm going to do it. I may die today. It's okay. We just don't think in those terms. But if the church en masse did, that would have to be dealt with. And I think we'd see more conflict on that kind of level.
What do you think the trajectory of the Western church is?
I think it's in decline. I think the only thing that can really save it is persecution. I think maybe in my lifetime we'll see the day when we have people from other parts of the world, the church from other parts of the world, coming here to rescue us, do evangelism and things like that. The way it was several hundred years ago, it was the reverse. For a long time, it was the reverse. But I just, we're Americans. We just think about ourselves so much and so often. The church is growing significantly in other places. The Chinese church outnumbers the population of the United States.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm not talking about nominal Christians. I'm talking about serious Christians, underground churches. And on one level, it's just math, because they have so many people. But on another level, that tells you something, because the persecution did not kill the church. Persecution ignited the church in China, as it has everywhere else. It's just the recipe for success, as far as the advance of the church. And so it's the same thing in Africa. It's the same thing I don't know if you. I'm not a charismatic. I'm what academically would be called the cautiously open person. But to be more generous with that, I try not to put the words can't and God in too many sentences. God is perfectly free if he wants to give someone in a Muslim country who has no revelation of the gospel. If he wants to send an angel, or he wants to have Jesus just show up and say, okay, I'm the Lord, get busy, he can do that. If he wants to do that, he can do that. I don't know a verse that says he can't. Well, Jesus is at the right hand of God. Well, yeah, he is. That's nice. I don't know. I don't have a Bible verse that says he's tied there to the seat. Okay, God can do what he wants. He doesn't need our permission to do it. He doesn't need to check with the systematic theologians in the West to do that. So, I've heard, these stories about people having visions of the Lord or some angelic visitation who are Muslim, and basically they have a Damascus Road experience, and they go out and start a church, and some of them die, some of their family members die, they're under terrible persecution, but they plant a church, and it thrives. There are just stories like that right today, in our current day, things like that happen. So if God wants to do that, great. Do it in Africa, do it in China, I don't care where he does it. I mean, we've all heard these stories, about the guardian angel stories, and all that kind of thing, even, of course, over here. But I'm talking about something that really looks like the book of Acts. That stuff you will still hear about in other places. And if God wants to do that, again, to make sure that the thing is never going to die. It is never going to die. It's never going to go away. And the short version is God does not need the American church to do what he wants done. We are not the new Israel. We never were, and we never will be. And we're not the 20th century kingdom of God. And we need to stop thinking of it this way. We need to sort of be put in our place, in the right sort of way. We need to sort of be reoriented to our role. And America has had a very important role for a long time, but we are not indispensable. We just have come to look at ourselves that way, but we're not. So I think the only thing that's going to sort of awaken the church in the West is persecution. And I'm not like clicking my heels and saying, sign me up. Nobody wants that. But I just don't see any other way for us to start looking like the book of Acts. I just don't. I think it's going to be some sort of necessary element there. I don't know what the degree would be, but something's got to click for that to happen. I think the church in the third world, these other parts of the world, will rescue the church over here at some point. They will be the necessary ingredient to revive the church over here.
I wanted to know if there's a resource that summarizes the Genesis 6 cohabitation narrative in other cultures that were not Mesopotamian.
Not Mesopotamian? Egypt doesn't really have it. I mean, Egypt has it in a really limited, with pharaohs and stuff like that.
I've heard of some Native American.
It's hard to tell with Native Americans because it's oral tradition, and you wonder how influenced by the West that has become, because most of them did not have written languages. For Native Americans, I mean, there are good resource books on Native American creation stories, Native American legends and stuff like that. I have a few of them, so you could find that sort of thing in those like reference volumes. Anthologies really is what they are. But again, it's like oral anthologies for the most part. The one that matters for biblical studies is Honest's article, obviously, that I referenced in the book. There literally is nothing like it. But beyond that, you're going to have Greco-Roman, the Titan mythology, the Titanomachy, the Theomachy, and all that kind of stuff from the Hesiod and some other sources. But the problem there is the Greek stuff. There are actually two versions of the Titan story that scholars of Greek, well, not prehistory, but sort of the Greek Dark Ages or whatever you want to call it, the most remote parts of Greek history, but after the advent of writing, some of the really, really old stuff, like even before Homer, but during that era. There are more than one version of the Titan story, and so it's difficult to know what's an addition and what's a subtraction, and if we should put them together, and if not, why, and all that sort of thing. And the reason it matters is because in some instances the Titans refer to the giants. In other places they don't. So to assume that every place you read about a Titan in Greek mythology you're talking about the counterpart of the Nephilim is incorrect. It just depends on what the source is and what the dating for that source is, which version it is. If it's a chicken or egg kind of question. But in Christian Middle Earth and other places, you'll see everything just sort of conflated together as though it's this coherent, Nephilim counterpart story. It is not. So that's a problem.
Is there anything
I
to
can
this?
I can send you. There are two really good articles on all of the Titan material that I could send you. What would cover that for you.
Is there anything to the six-finger connection across those?
It's never mentioned apart, from the one instance, in biblical thinking, you don't get it. Like you don't get it with the alcohol and things like that. I think it's a historical comment, that was present in that instance, with that individual. I don't think there's any reference to being an inherited trait or a necessary trait. Polydactylism in the ancient world was like unusual height, viewed as something that indicated divine parentage, generally, some sort of divine input to that person's birth in some way. Why? Because it wasn't normal. It's very simple. This is not a normal human trait. There must be something special about it. Something must have happened at your birth that created this. Again, they have no idea of genetics. They have no idea of genetic deformities. They don't know any of this. But that's not normal, so you must be special. You're different. It's just part of the whole world. It's the same thing in Egypt. You get pharaoh. Like there's one pharaoh that was unusually tall, like 6.5 feet, which is quite a bit taller than the average Egyptian. So that pharaoh was considered that was considered evidence of his divine birth, his status as the incarnation of Horus, stuff like that. That was like a proof, it was a litmus test or something. It just validated the claim. So you get stuff like that.
So do you think there were giants that were a lot taller than that?
No, for me, I think the biblical giants were the same height that unusually tall people are now, anywhere from 6.5 to the 8 foot range, and that's based upon the skeletal material is really evasive because there are a lot of skeletons. And I've corresponded a bit with the Israeli archaeologist who maintains the skeletal database in Tel Aviv, but it's really unusual, and I don't even know if there are any examples in his database of a skeleton beyond 1000 BC, first millennium, and that's because the Israelis and none of the Canaanite cultures evolved. So if you died on the battlefield in 2000 BC, there is literally nothing left. It just is gone. It's lost to the sands of time. Bone actually does disappear. It doesn't just like stick around all the time forever. So it's really unusual. But the skeletons that are there, again, first millennium, the average Israeli male, I think, was 5'4", 5'5", just measuring the skeletons. And human height, as time goes on, has tended to increase because of nutrition and medicine, longer lifespans, that kind of thing. So they figure, another millennium prior to that, the average male was probably an inch shorter, 5'3", 5'4", something like that. So if you have people that are, again, abnormally tall, 6.5, 7 feet tall, that's a huge difference. And if you get them clustered in populations, because naturally they're going to be interbreeding, and this is going to become a dominant trait, that you don't go into a town that's populated with Anakim where they all look like Flozell Adams or whatever. Pick a lineman, they all look like J.J. Watt or whatever. You don't go into that town thinking, oh, we got this. You go in there expecting to get destroyed. Because not only are they a whole lot bigger than you are, but you're really not a trained soldier or a trained army. You're the next generation that did what? What did you do? You wandered in the desert for 40 years? You know how to hunt? You could catch a jackrabbit? Oh, great. You're a great soldier, aren't you? They're not trained. Whereas these other guys, they lived in walled cities. They're used to warfare because this is what you do when you're cities. You fight other cities. They have, they have better weapons. The Israelite spies, they weren't kidding. We're just dog meat. We're going to go in there and just get buried. Just forget. And of course Joshua and Caleb were like, hey, don't you remember this thing at the Red Sea? We couldn't pull that off either. But we did that because God was on our side. So are you going to believe that or not? And everybody says, no, we're not going to believe that. Show us the way out. You don't need these monstrous, examples. Again, giants 300 feet tall in the Book of Enoch. You don't need this sort of crazy height, to have the giant clan battles and descriptions be historical, in the biblical world. All you need is again a decent amount of people who are a whole lot bigger than you, and it's a legitimate threat. It's legit. So that's how I look at the whole giant of it. Goliath is the only one who's actually measured. The Masoretic text has him at 9 feet 6 or 9 feet 9, depending on how you take the cubit. The Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't have him at that height. The Dead Sea Scrolls has him at 6 feet 6 inches. Okay, well, okay, we might have just toppled a good Sunday school lesson, but guess what? He's still a good foot taller, and he's a trained soldier. He's a warrior, compared to any Israelite.
Mm-hmm.
Pick one. He's no match. It's still a total mismatch, and it still fits the story, especially when his adversary is a kid. 13, 14, 15, whatever, this is ridiculous. There's no way that this kid's going to win. Well, not necessarily. I love the story because, what's David doing all day other than tending the sheep? He's probably out there with his sling practicing. He probably looked at Goliath and thought, good grief, man. I've been hitting targets this size. This is like putting a huge pumpkin on somebody's shoulders. I'm just going to take him out. I mean, he is just toast. It was probably an easy shot, compared to what he's been doing. And he had God's help too. The lion and the bear, and like David says, "Look, God help me. I know what I'm doing here." And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. So I love the story. It's just a classic mismatch, and God prepared him every moment of his life for that event. None of it was lost. That's what we miss. We tend to look at the miraculous part of it, but God had prepared this guy for that moment. God picks the right guy. He's not going to miss. He knows what he's doing. But even Goliath, 6.5 feet tall. Everybody refers to Og's bed. I discuss this in the book. Og's bed is exactly the number of cubits as the bed associated with the Entomaki, I hope I got that right, ziggurat in Babylon. It was the bed of sacred prostitution for one of their gods. And I think that it just can't be a coincidence because it is like literally 13 by, it's exactly the measurement you see in Deuteronomy used of Og. So on the one hand, it's his bed. It's not him, it's his bed. But the messaging behind that is the writer is associating Og with divine human, again, sexual cohabitation, because that's what the bed was for in Mesopotamia, which, surprise, surprise, that's where the Apkallu came from, who are the Mesopotamian counterparts to the Nephilim. The number of the bed connects Og back to the Nephilim. That's what it does. So, we don't necessarily know that this was designed to give us Og's own height, but the bed is a telltale sign that this guy is one of them. It's unmistakable to anyone who knew the other referent. They know exactly why that's there and what it's doing, what it telegraphs. But, we don't, it just takes, this is Anas's article. This is why it's so valuable to reevaluate all the Mesopotamian material back in 2010 with an eye toward the first 4 verses. There's just nothing like it. So that's why I tell people, and I know it's going to irritate people, as the book gets read, it's going to irritate people on both sides, but what it amounts to is really 2 things. All of your commentaries that your pastors have been consulting about Genesis 6:1-4, in the hope of getting away from the supernaturalist view, all of them are hopelessly out of date. They do not include any discussion of the original Mesopotamian context that Genesis 6:1-4 is written to oppose. And what it's targeting is a story with supernatural flavorings. You can't parse it correctly if you strip Genesis 6:1-4 of the supernaturalist view. You can make it feel comfortable. You can make it be nice and go away. But you can also stop talking about interpreting the Bible in context. That's what you need to do. Just politely excuse yourself from that discussion. because you ain't doing it. That's what it does. So I'll take, hits on both sides of that, for Hannes's article. But that's what it means to interpret the Bible in context. This is what they're shooting at. Every point for point, before, after the flood, the giants, the calamity, everything is right there. It's very apparent what they are shooting at and why. So sure, you can ignore it. Good for you. But like I said, just don't talk to me about interpreting the Bible in its own context anymore. So, another rabbit trail. Any real questions?
I've heard the comparison between the Tower of Babel and what they were doing to CERN and them with the antimatter and opening a black hole.
Yeah.
And I just
they're
wanted
not,
your thoughts.
They're not doing plasma physics and quantum physics and everything else like that. This whole, I don't buy any of it. I do think there was serious, what I would call high technology in the ancient world. But high technology for them doesn't mean it's our same high technology. I would suggest to you that people who could build the pyramids, okay, that's really impressive technology. They're not using anti-gravity. Back to the Wally Wallington thing, they were masters of applied physics. They understood weight and counterweight. They understood leverage. They understood physics in that way. And if a retired contractor in Flint, Michigan, can pour and move and erect a 25,000-pound piece of concrete without the wheel, I think the Egyptians could probably handle their task because it's scalable. What Wally Wallington in Michigan shows you on home video that he can do is easily replicable and scalable. I don't know that the Egyptians used that method that Wally's using. But the point is that you could do this if you understand how to take away weight to move weight, and he does. So that's impressive. Just because they're not building lasers or super colliders doesn't mean they were dumb. They're not dumb. They're doing things that we would be hard pressed to imitate using their tools and their context to pull off. Now who's the dummy? They put us back there, and now who is the moron? It ain't them. So we have this misunderstanding, I think, of high technology in the ancient world. That it has to be what that means to us. Or why? I mean, they didn't have the sort of electricity. Oh, what about the Baghdad battery? Yeah, the aliens gave them that. Yeah, right. All you need is lemon juice and copper, okay, to reproduce that and conduct the electricity. Because archaeologists who've actually looked at the Baghdad battery understood that that's how they did that. And they did generate a small amount of electricity. Very clever, very creative. They're not building super colliders with lemons, okay, and little jars of clay. They're not doing that. So people take these examples of ancient technology and somehow extrapolate to the 21st century. It's just incoherent. I don't know any way to describe it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to echo what you just said. When you go to the Middle East, you see these huge ancient temples. I mean, these things are huge.
Yeah, they're ridiculous.
And you sit there and look at that there, and you look way up there, and you think, how did they do this? Well, the Roman Empire. Look at all the roads, the water systems, and everything, aqueducts that they built. We're still using them.
Yeah. They're not dumb. And even something like, let's take the columns at Karnak, which are enormous. Okay, now again, we don't know that this is exactly what the Egyptians did, although there are hints that they did it this way. But do you realize those columns are not whole pieces? They're a number of pieces. They're, marshmallows or whatever piled on top of each other and then polished so that it looks like one column, put plastered over and carved and all that. You just need one at a time. So what you do is you build a ramp with sand or dirt or whatever, pull it up, put it on. Add a little bit to the ramp, pull it up, put it on. Pull it up, put it on. That's all you need to do. How do you erect an obelisk? You build a ramp, you dig a hole, you drop the thing, and then you take away the sand. Ta-da! I mean, again, nobody's claiming to know exactly how they did everything, but there are ancient methods of construction that are very workable.
Mhm.
They're very workable. So I just laugh every time I hear one of these shows that scientists are just absolutely mystified. And no, they're not. They're really not. There's a whole discipline of ancient historical technology in the history of science field that people have spent careers looking at this stuff. It's just that the people running these websites and doing these mockumentaries never tap into the journal literature. It's like they assume that if there's information out there, it must live on the internet. No, most of the good stuff does not live on the internet. It exists in scholarly journals because scholars write for their own guild. They write for themselves. They're not writing thinking, oh, I hope Bob over at Missouri State University, hopefully he finds this useful. They're not doing that at all. They're writing for the guild. They're writing for their peers, doing research. And most of it never filters down to the average person. And even if it did, it's hard to access because you have to belong to a university or have an account where you can get to journal databases and find the stuff. It's not on the web. It's just not on the web. So that's why in interviews, I'm constantly saying, look, on the blog, most of the information that answer these questions, that addresses what you think is a mystery, exists, but you're never going to find it because you're not aware of the tools to get you to that information. So go out to the local university, say, I want a community borrowing card, give me an ID number, and I'm going to sit there and troll through journal databases. And then you'll find stuff. But most people they either don't know that they can do that or they won't bother to do that. Because having a nuclear power plant at Ballard, so that's just sexy. There's nothing, it's not coherent. The whole approach is not coherent. But I'm the stick in the mud. That's my role. I am the stick in the mud. And I'm happy to play that role.
It's really impressive though to see all those buildings like that there. They all had to be built at just the right angle so that the bottom block wouldn't be crushed. I mean, they had a wall.
And they had failures.
Oh yes.
There are pyramids that collapsed. And that's the question I love. Well, if the aliens told them how to do this, why did they ever fail? Why did it ever go wrong? Why did they have to improve the process?
Because they were human beings.
Yeah, did the aliens get it wrong? We're in trouble now. We should have told them the right way. It's just dumb. It's just absurd. You don't need this. The evolution of what the pyramid was and where it came from is very detectable in Egypt. It starts with mastabas, which are burial chambers. And they just keep building on top of them. We like this model now. But again, it doesn't always work. There are collapses. There are projects that had to be scrapped. There are places where they didn't, account for the foundation properly, and one side sank. They're just scattered all over Egypt, but those aren't the ones that make it into the books, or the websites, or the Ancient Aliens documentary. They're just there. They're real. But those aren't the ones that get the attention. It just irritates me to know. I think you can tell. Why? Why do we have to do this?
I've often wondered about that, the one that failed. And all right, somebody's got to go down and report to the pharaoh and tell him that it failed.
Like Sneferu's step pyramid, they had to add to it again to address mistakes. It's actually built in stages, and you can tell because of the brick that's used and how it's laid out. And again, they're trying to buttress this thing over here and create a different entrance, because the one collapsed. They make mistakes. Okay, they're brilliant, but just like brilliant engineers today, some things go wrong. You can't anticipate everything. And the evidence of their failures and trying to deal with their failures and their successes, when they improvise and they come up with solutions to their engineering problems, is there. It's a very human process.
Mm-hmm.
So you either have an inept alien, had a bad day, I don't know how in their vast cosmic knowledge they could have ever made a mistake.
Where'd that idea that alien ever come from anyway? That galls me.
Well, in terms of interaction with human civilization.
Well, the pyramids and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, well, yeah, that comes, a lot of it is 19th century speculation about previous races, like Atlantis and their forebears, and their ancestors, and that kind of thing. So, that the 19th century was just sort of the wild, wild west of intellectual stuff. It was an intellectual free-for-all, which I have to admit would have been kind of fun. If you were living back then to just sort of try to keep up with all that stuff and the wonder of the speculation of it. So I don't necessarily view everybody there as a villain. If I were living in the 19th century, it would have been really cool. I would have loved to have been a graduate student in the 19th century. He's got all these crazy ideas. But to me, they wouldn't have been crazy. They would have been fascinating because I would have been a product of at the same time. But,
I guess we didn't
That's
know
what
any
it is.
better. A lot of times you don't know any better, so you come up with all these speculative ideas.
Sure, and ideas get tested and things, settle out. People go back to primary sources and say, well, this idea, like the Jesus mythicist thing. A lot of that late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's based upon incomplete data sets and logical flaws, cause and effect flaws instead of correlation, that kind of thing. But stuff like that shakes out. Eventually there are people who get interested enough in the work, in the field, in the idea, and they take it upon themselves to reevaluate everything and try to track down new material, and you have a new perspective on it because someone does the work. And without it, you're just sort of stuck.
Well, it's just like you pointed out, 1,000 years from now, somebody will look back at us and say,
And think
boy,
we're idiots.
yeah,
They'll look at us as
where'd they come up with that idea?
I can't believe they believe that. Those poor, bless their pointed little heads, that kind of thing. Because we can't imagine what it'll be, a millennium from now. Just look at the difference between this millennium and the one previous. Just the technology that we have that we take for granted, microwaves. Just think about it. I remember when we got the first microwave oven in our house. We would put things in and just watch it. My mom, my dad, let me try something. What will it do to this? we did it, because it was unthinkable. That, okay, I put it in this thing and I hit the button and it just spins around and now it's hot. That's just amazing. Where's the heat coming from? Because you're doing flame or the electric burners. Where's the heat? It's where'd it come from? It just sucked out of the air or something. That was a marvel.
Well,
I remember that.
Air conditioning has allowed cities like Phoenix and all those places now to flourish. Couldn't have flourished 100 years ago.
Desalination of salt water.
Man on the moon.
Flying. It's just incredible. Wireless technology. That still mystifies me. I remember sending my first email. And you want to check with the person, call them. Did you get that?
Yeah.
And it's yeah, I have it. It's how did that work? You got it in a second, and you live 2,000 miles away. How in the world is that possible? The analogy, of course, is the phone. If you're used to that, now you're typing something, and you're not verbally doing anything. You're hitting a button, and then someone gets it. And now we do it even without wires. This is stuff in my own lifetime. It was just unthinkable when I was a kid. It's just crazy.
Do you think any of that's fallen angel technology, or is it just humans finally got there where they're smart enough to think it?
Yeah, I think if you actually look at what Enoch, the Book of Enoch talks about, with watchers, giving people technology. I'm trying to remember the list off the top of my head, but there are some of it's metallurgical, some of it, of course, is astronomical, zodiac, that kind of thing, celestial, what we would call celestial divination, at least at that time. Weaponry. I know that there's knowledge of roots and herbs, which is probably a reference again to drugs. It's like sorcery practices, because some of the terminology shows up in the Old Testament in those contexts, and forbidden practices. Again, mind-altering kinds of things like the DMT molecule, hallucinogens, because of you tapping into the spirit world and all that. I don't know if that's the complete list. So, in the sense that all of those things either are related to bloodshed or tapping into what was considered and presumably divine knowledge. In other words, contact with the other side in some way, either through reading the signs in the heavens, again, messaging, it's spiritual, theological messaging. Again, because of the belief that either the gods are controlling these things and they're leaving messages here. Certainly, the Judeo-Christian world is part of that too. So in that sense of trying to manipulate humanity through messaging, through celestial divination, through hallucinogenic experiences, or sorcery, that kind of thing. Again, to gain a spiritual hold over the population, or to present themselves as the correct source of information, or the desirable source of information. Yeah, I do think that there was a sinister, dark intelligence behind getting people distracted by those other means. Because but what's the goal? The goal is to abandon the methods that Yahweh tells you about, to abandon Him as the source of your spiritual knowledge, to treat other imagers as you should treat them. Because when you killed a person, it was killing God in effigy, according to Genesis 9:6. So all of these things are aimed at human destruction and to break the relationship between humanity and Yahweh. So I do tend to think that there was a spiritual motivation and power behind that because of the agenda that goes with it.
Do you think there's any quantum physics and otherwise?
I don't think it requires anything like that. I don't know why spirit beings need technology to begin with. Again, we're casting them in our own terms. Why does a divine being need a portal? Why does it need electricity? I mean, have you ever thought about that? Why do we think in these terms? Why do they need these things? You can postulate like how this would work at a quantum level. I mean, I understand that, and I understand that we can have the discussion about other worlds in terms of alternate universes and things like that. That modern physics makes part of the discussions. I understand that, but what my question is why would we assume there's a dependence on these things? And I don't really see any reason to assume that, even though we might find out someday that, hey, this activity really did have to do with multidimensional this or that. That to me is plausible. But I just don't see the necessity for us to think they need to build something to come here.
So why wasn't the Book of Enoch canonized when it's referenced in the Bible in numerous places?
Support for it ran out of gas. It doesn't matter that a book is referenced in the Bible. The Baal cycle is referenced in the Bible. It's not canonical. Menander, the Greek poet, is referenced in the Bible. Euripides. All these things tell us is that the biblical writers were reading stuff, and the stuff that they read helped them articulate some point they were writing about. It was good source material that helped them get their point across. Kind of like you read a good commentary of the article today. That doesn't mean you consider it at the level of Scripture. It just helps you understand something about Scripture, and then teach that to someone else. The fact that you're using it to help you think clearly doesn't mean that it deserves canonical status. And that's all they're doing. I mean, they're reading lots of things. I like to use this analogy. If I were a Calvinist, and I've read the works of John Calvin, I've read Calvin's commentaries on Romans, I've read the Institutes to Christian Religion, it's going to be really hard for me to not have Calvin in my head when I'm preaching through Romans. Because there are going to be things he said that I would find insightful, or I mean even unconsciously, not deliberately. I'm going to say something that was what he said because it's just sort of ingrained in my head because I read it, I studied it. It was helpful. Well, it's the same thing in the ancient world. They're reading things. They're literate. They're very familiar with books that we now refer to as Second Temple Judaism, like Enoch. Enoch was very evidently quite widely read and embraced as something to be taken seriously. Peter and Jude certainly did. And Enoch actually shows up in lots of places, either directly or indirectly in other places in the New Testament that you wouldn't sort of expect it. But you can tell that there's Enochian flavoring here, Enochian influence over something that's being said. And again, all that means is Enoch is helping the biblical writer at some point in his life to think carefully, to think well about something in his Old Testament for something he wants to say to his church now. And that just helps him do the job, helps him to communicate. His material is the one that's under inspiration, not the thing that helps him think or helps him make a point, use the right word or something like that. Enoch itself, it had a few defenders, if you want. I mean, there's a really good, I don't know, it's 15, 20, probably 20 pages or so, from a book called by Vanderkam, something about Jewish and Christian apocalyptic. But the first chapter in it is sort of the history of Enochian perception in the early church and what the discussion was. So Tertullian defended it for a while. Irenaeus, again, was a defender for a while. Origen, yes and no. But it has that chapter has a really interesting anecdote. I'm trying to remember which church father it was. It might have been Tertullian. Either Tertullian or Origen, one of those guys. But toward the end of his life, he actually, in one of his letters, one of his writings again, he talks about his support for Enoch, and he basically says, paraphrasing, I'm kind of the only one still out here that thinks this should be the canon. And apparently, the Spirit of God has moved in the church, and I'm wrong. I was wrong. What it tells you is it assumes that they assume that the Spirit of God would direct the church, the massive amount of people. The Spirit of God would move the herd to the right conclusion about what ought to be in the New Testament. And he's basically saying, I guess I was wrong. So he was content to let the Spirit speak to the majority of the church at large. Not a few select elite leaders, but just anywhere that the church was. Enoch just did not take hold. Now, in Africa, it did, with the Ethiopian church. They still revere it as sacred today, but they're the only ones. So within, what we would think of as Western civilization, he basically said, I guess I was wrong. Now, me personally, I answer the question this way. I don't care. If I get to heaven one day and God says, hey, Mike, you did a good job with the Enoch thing, well, you missed the boat there. I should have been. I'm not going to be discouraged. I'm not going to ask for a rating check. I'm going to say, well, it's a good thing I read it then. In other words, I think we should read the books that the biblical writers wrote or read. I mean, we should read that stuff so it helps us know what they were thinking and how they were thinking about something. It doesn't matter if it's inspired or not, just read it. Make it part of what informs you because it informed them. Just sort of a simple recipe. That's how I approach it. There are things in Enoch you don't want. It'll make you not want it to be canonical. But people ever sort of get to those places? It had its defenders. Had its detractors too. Anybody else? Anything else? So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Many times over.
Thanks for inviting me.